Her city reduced to ash, a capital devoured by fire. But the true horror? It wasn't the enemy who ordered it. It was their own general. In a war already drowning in blood, one man made a decision so catastrophic it erased a civilization overnight. This wasn't conquest. This was annihilation, calculated down to the wind's direction. Who was the general who chose flames over surrender, and why did he vanish without a trace after watching his empire burn? Like, if you believe power can corrupt even the noblest, comment what you would have done in his place and subscribe for the secret history that his enemies were too shocked to rewrite. The smoke still rises from the ashes of memory, carrying with it the screams of a nation torn apart by one man's devastating decision. In the twilight hours of a war that had already claimed countless souls, a general stood before the greatest city of his time, watching flames dance against the horizon like demons celebrating their victory. This was not just any military commander, but a man whose name would be whispered in horror for generations to come, a figure whose single command would transform the very fabric of civilization itself. Picture the scene that unfolded on that fateful night when the world changed forever. The cobblestones of ancient streets, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, now cracked and split under the intense heat of deliberately set fires. The general, his uniform stained with ash and his eyes reflecting the inferno he had unleashed, stood motionless as his life's work reduced everything he had once sworn to protect to smoldering ruins. The irony was not lost on him, nor on the thousands who fled screaming into the darkness, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and the memories of a world that no longer existed. The decision had not come easily, though history would remember it as the act of a madman. For months the general had watched his enemies close in, their armies moving like a tightening noose around the throat of his beloved capital. Every strategic retreat had brought them closer to this moment. Every fallen soldier had been a step toward this ultimate catastrophe. The reports that reached his war tent grew more desperate with each passing day. Supply lines cut, reinforcements slaughtered, allies abandoning their posts under cover of darkness. Yet through it all, one option remained unspoken, hovering like a specter in the shadows of his consciousness. The capital was more than just a city. It was the beating heart of an empire that had stood for centuries. Its libraries contained the accumulated wisdom of ages. Its treasures represented the artistic achievements of countless generations. Its people carried within them the living memory of a culture that had shaped the known world. To destroy it would be to commit an act of such profound devastation that the very concept of civilization would need to be redefined. Yet as the enemy forces drew ever closer, as their siege engines began to appear on the distant hills like mechanical vultures waiting to feast on carrion, the general found himself contemplating the unthinkable. The psychology of such a decision reveals itself in layers, each more disturbing than the last. Here was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the service of his nation, who had bled on countless battlefields in defense of everything the capital represented. His military genius was legendary. His tactical brilliance had saved the empire on numerous occasions. His loyalty was beyond question. Yet somewhere in the depths of his strategic mind, he had calculated that if he could not have his capital, then no one could. The enemy would find nothing but ashes and bones. Their victory would taste of smoke and defeat, even in triumph. The preparations began in secret, carried out by the general's most trusted officers, who questioned nothing and obeyed without hesitation. Barrels of oil were positioned throughout the city's most important districts. Bundles of dry wood were stacked against the walls of ancient monuments, and teams of soldiers received orders that would haunt them for the remainder of their lives. The civilian population remained unaware, going about their daily routines even as their doom was being methodically prepared around them. Children played in streets that would soon become rivers of fire. Merchants hawked their wares in markets that would be reduced to ash before dawn. Lovers met in gardens that would become funeral pyres. As the enemy forces finally breached the outer defenses, the general gave the signal that would echo through eternity. The first flames appeared simultaneously across dozens of locations, spreading with a speed and intensity that suggested something far beyond accident or coincidence. The wind that night seemed to carry the fire with supernatural eagerness, as if the very elements had conspired to ensure the destruction would be complete and absolute. Within hours, the greatest city of its age was transformed into a vision of hell itself. its skyline reduced to skeletal remains silhouetted against an apocalyptic glow. The human cost was incalculable, not merely in the thousands who perished in the flames, but in the countless more whose lives were forever shattered by what they witnessed. Survivors would carry the trauma for generations, passing down through their bloodlines a genetic memory of that terrible night when their world ended. The enemy soldiers, arriving to claim their prize, found themselves confronting not victory but an abomination that challenged their very understanding of warfare and human nature. Even hardened veterans wept at the sight of what deliberate destruction could accomplish when unleashed without restraint. The general himself disappeared into history shortly after his terrible command was executed, some say consumed by madness, others claiming he simply vanished into the smoke and was never seen again. His name became synonymous with the ultimate act of spite, the final revenge of a defeated commander who chose to destroy rather than surrender. Military historians would debate for centuries whether his decision was the product of strategic brilliance or psychological collapse, whether he was a patriot who saved his nation's honor or a monster who committed the ultimate war crime. The flames that consumed the capital that night burned for weeks, visible from distances that seemed impossible, creating their own weather patterns as the intense heat generated winds and storms that spread the destruction even further. Ancient texts speak of the sky itself seeming to weep, as the smoke and ash created clouds that rained black tears upon the surrounding countryside. The environmental impact was catastrophic. The agricultural devastation lasted for years, and the psychological scars affected every soul who witnessed the apocalypse. In the aftermath, when the embers finally cooled and the true scope of the destruction became clear, investigators attempted to piece together exactly how one man's decision had resulted in such comprehensive annihilation. The systematic nature of the burning suggested planning that had taken months, coordination that required the participation of hundreds of soldiers, and a level of preparation that indicated the general had always known this moment would come. The discovery of hidden caches of accelerants, the strategic placement of ignition points, the careful timing that ensured maximum spread, all pointed to a mind that had calculated destruction with the same precision others used to plan construction. The enemy commander who finally entered the ruined capital wrote in his personal diary that the sight was beyond anything his experience had prepared him for. Streets that should have been filled with the spoils of victory were instead clogged with the charred remains of a civilization. Buildings that should have housed his triumphant army were nothing but hollow shells, their walls blackened and their contents reduced to ash. The victory he had fought so hard to achieve tasted of nothing but smoke and regret, leaving him to wonder if conquest meant anything when there was nothing left to conquer. The ripple effects of that night's destruction spread far beyond the immediate geographical area, creating political upheavals that reshaped the entire region for generations to come. Allied nations that had depended on the capital's trade networks found themselves economically devastated. Refugee populations strained resources across the continent, and the psychological impact of witnessing such deliberate destruction created a new form of warfare that would haunt military strategists for centuries. The concept of total war, of destruction so complete that victory became meaningless, entered human consciousness that night and never left. Archaeological excavations conducted centuries later revealed the true horror of what had been accomplished. Beneath layers of ash and debris, researchers found evidence of lives cut short in the most brutal manner imaginable. Families huddled together in their final moments. Children's toys melted into unrecognizable shapes, personal belongings transformed into twisted metal and ceramic fragments that told stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary catastrophe. The scientific analysis of the burn patterns confirmed what historical accounts had suggested. This was not the result of accident or enemy action, but the systematic implementation of a plan designed to leave nothing standing. The general's legacy became a cautionary tale that transcended the boundaries of his era, inspiring literature, philosophy, and military doctrine for generations to come. Writers would use his story as a metaphor for the dangers of absolute power. Philosophers would debate the ethics of his choice, and military academies would study his tactics while warning of the moral precipice that awaits those who mistake destruction for victory. His name became synonymous with the concept that sometimes the cure can be worse than the disease, that in trying to deny the enemy everything, one might lose their own humanity in the process. The physical scars of that night remained visible for decades, as the ruins of the great capital stood as a monument to the destructive power of human decision-making. Pilgrims would travel from distant lands to witness the aftermath, to stand among the broken stones and contemplate the fragility of civilization itself. The site became a place of mourning and reflection, where the living could confront the reality of what happens when the bonds that hold society together are deliberately severed by those entrusted to protect them. Modern historians continue to debate whether the general's actions constituted a war crime by the standards of his time, or whether they represented a legitimate military tactic in an era when the rules of engagement were far different from contemporary understanding. The moral complexity of his decision defies simple categorization. Was he a patriot who denied his enemies their prize, or a war criminal who prioritized spite over the lives of innocent civilians? The answer perhaps lies not in the judgment of history, but in the recognition that human nature contains the capacity for both sublime heroism and incomprehensible destruction, sometimes within the same individual facing an impossible choice. The story of the general who burned his own capital serves as a reminder that the greatest tragedies often arise not from the actions of obvious villains, but from the decisions of those who believe themselves to be heroes. In his mind, he was saving his nation's honor, denying the enemy their moment of triumph, ensuring that his people would be remembered for their defiance rather than their defeat. Yet the reality of his choice was far more complex, creating suffering that extended far beyond the military considerations that motivated his decision, leaving scars that would take generations to heal. The flames that consumed the capital that night were more than just fire consuming wood and stone. They were the physical manifestation of human will pushed beyond all rational limits, the visible expression of what happens when the desire to control becomes more important than the lives being controlled. The general's story stands as eternal testimony to the danger of believing that destruction can ever be a form of creation, that endings can somehow transform into beginnings through the simple application of enough violence and determination. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this tale is not the destruction itself, but the silence that followed. In the weeks after the burning, as the last embers finally died and the wind scattered the ashes across the landscape, a profound quiet settled over the ruins that seemed to mock the very concept of human achievement. Where once the sounds of commerce, conversation, and daily life had created the symphony of civilization, now only the occasional groan of settling rubble and the whisper of wind through empty window frames remained to mark the passage of time. The general's officers, those who had carried out his final orders, found themselves unable to speak of what they had witnessed. Many took their own lives in the months that followed, unable to reconcile their loyalty to their commander with the horror of what that loyalty had ultimately produced. Others simply disappeared into the chaos